Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're having another edition of our weekly segment, the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, co-host of the Redspin Sports podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And well, Nate, your boy, Tommy Tuberville, former football coach of Auburn University, not only recently won his race against Democrat Doug Jones in Alabama, who, of course, is probably best known for beating Roy Moore after allegations of sexual misconduct with young girls. But Tuberville has also recently taken to Twitter to defend Donald Trump from what he alleges is an election being stolen from him as votes continue to come in this highly contentious election here in the United States. Tuberville likened the situation to a football game, saying, quote, "It's like the whistle has blown, the game is over, and the players have gone home, but the referees are suddenly adding touchdowns to the other team's side of the scoreboard. I challenge that as a coach, and Trump is right to challenge that as a candidate." And so, Nate, I'm just sort of wondering what you're making, not only of Tuberville's recent victory, but of his comments around what's happening in the election right now.
Well, Sean, I find it remarkable because Tommy Tuberville is a guy, just to give a little context, who grew up in Arkansas. He coached on some of the defensive backs coach at the University of Miami during a lot of their glory year teams in the 1980s under Jimmy Johnson. He was the head coach at University of Mississippi, colloquially known as Ole Miss, the Ole Miss Rebels, which is definitely, as much as the university has tried to distance themselves from the fact that that is definitely an allusion to the rebels, meaning the Confederate rebels. He had a totally disingenuous, ask where he was kind of hailed. And I remember as a young kid kind of thinking, Tuberville's, must be somewhat of a progressive coach. He's trying to ban the Confederate flag from games. If you look at Ole Miss's uniforms, the name Ole Miss itself, by the way, he was the head coach there from 94 to 98 before going to Auburn, where he developed his Alabama roots from 99 to 2008 for some context. But he asked fans at Ole Miss to stop bringing the Confederate flag to games, a symbol of the rebels, and ultimately just making the point very clearly, matter of factly, that had nothing to do with social justice. It's purely, as he says, the best players in the state of Alabama and the state of Mississippi are black, and we're not getting our fair share of them as long as that flag's flying at our games. And even when they brought in the university, a PR guy to come talk to him about this and how it would help if he made a statement, he didn't want to get involved, because it was ultimately, he wanted it to just go away, but he didn't want to have to take a position that himself of support for taking down the Confederate flag. Surely, in his mind, a symbol of heritage. But we just heard recruiting. So let's skip forward a little bit now. We see, Tuberville has now won the Alabama Senate race, and people are wondering, where does this guy come from? Some people joking about, all the Alabama Crimson Tide fans that voted for the former Auburn coach, that the only coach that's ever beaten Alabama 6 years in a row. But the reality is, as much as people want to talk about Alabama, Auburn, and the hate fest that is, there's an alignment that's much more real along ideology. And Tuberville represents the mentality of the typical SEC Southern football fan, which, matter of factly, is these players are replaceable. We want to go in meat market-like status, go recruit, get our best players out of, the small kind of podunk towns in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and also the inner city, under-resourced, underfunded, intentionally ghettoized, communities that in places like Atlanta and places like New Orleans and Montgomery, Alabama, and Birmingham, that are the very communities he's going to now take part in, systematically underfunding, systematically depriving of resources, systematically oversupplying with cops. Meanwhile, this man built his entire success on the backs of predominantly black, unpaid athletic labor. You look at just some of the comments made by former players of his, and it's really quite remarkable that you have so many former Auburn players that just called it for what it is. That they feel extremely disappointed that this guy has built his whole legacy on the back, like I just mentioned, and on the backs of largely black labor, and yet is now in these positions. I'll give an example here, which is. Let me pull up here. I mean, former Auburn star Tommy Jackson, who played from 2002 to 2005, said it's very disingenuous. He coached a team that had a majority of African-American players, and President Trump has no interest in black males. And for Coach Tuberville, who they call Tub, to support someone like that, what does that say about somebody who has always thought this way to make millions of dollars off the same people the president is intending to overlook or mistreat? It's shameful. It's downright shameful. So we can get into some more. I mean, this is the same guy, too, who had to settle in 2013, which ended up being the end of his college coaching, the beginning of it, at least, the beginning of the end, at least, when he was at the University of Cincinnati, settling a fraud lawsuit filed by investors in a hedge fund that he helped run. His business partner pleaded guilty to securities fraud a couple months ago. It was sentenced to 10 years in order to pay back $2.1 million. Tuberville, after settling, was not charged with a crime. So very in keeping with kind of what goes on the Trump world of, if you can get ahead, that's just playing the game. And, it's just much like many Southerners, they love the black individual, right? He'll love surely the player that helps him win. That's a good guy, but they fear the collective. And that's the essence of really the deeply rooted racism in the Deep South, I feel like. And Tuberville is just the representation of that.
Yeah, Nate, one of the other former players said, that he actually wasn't surprised. This was Adlai Trone. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He said, "I'm not surprised. I know at some point Tuberville, had considered running for some other offices. His name has rung in the political world for a couple of years. It's a big jump, but not surprised at all." And other players said that, they just weren't surprised by it because of where he is financially and aligning with big business and stuff like that. They could see that from that standpoint. But, the fact that Tuberville has made comments promoting birtherism, complained about environmentalists, said that immigrants were bringing drugs and diseases, and talked about, socialist and communist indoctrination of the education system. I feel like something that it was actually Jackson said about why he thought Tuberville was doing this is really important in the context of the relationship between these coaches and the players and who profits off of whom. Because Jackson said in terms of power, when he was asked why he thinks Tuberville is doing this, he said in terms of power, popularity, social capital, what's beyond being a head football coach at Auburn University in the state of Alabama in the Southeastern Conference, running for public office? To me, this is a power grab. And I feel like that is so indicative of the relationship between capitalism and Black bodies and Black labor and brown bodies and brown labor as well, but especially in this context of football, which I just think it continues to reflect the truism that sports is always political because it has in it the values of the society that it exists in. So, I mean, what do you think that means? That, that in terms of power and social capital, there was nowhere else for Tuberville to go, and that he was able to traffic in the social capital that his position gave him. And that's not something that the players themselves can really traffic in.
No, not at all. I mean, not at least, the ones who make it onto the NFL, a few of those, and even at a big school like Auburn, it's still a distinct minority. They are already 21, 22 years old before they can even legally begin to do that. And not to mention, if there is some sort of impropriety, scandal, player receiving impermissible benefits, it's never the situation where, it's the system itself that creates this. Look at all the money being made. Sometimes you hear it now in more more enlightened discourse in recent years about this issue. But for so long, and still the overwhelming majority of the opinions are that, these are the rules, you can try to change them. But let's get college football is really, and the reason we keep harping on it is in season. It's remarkable. It's being just marching forward during a pandemic like this. It became a huge campaign shift. It's like a way for Trump, as we saw during the debate, as we saw that, Clay Travis had his sidekick, Jason Whitlock, actually interviewing President Trump in the White House just, 2 weeks before the election. And all of this is like, in their minds, it gets back to the idea that these people that have no problem exploiting the free labor of, black bodies in the context of SEC football or college football in general. At the same time, they don't see the other stuff is political. They don't see, like, in their minds, just, the Uber jingoism you see before games, the tying together of, American exceptionalism, and the idea that American exceptionalism is tied up into, and that football is sort of an expression of that on a domestic level, but that in some ways, they're viewing that as like the preparation of people to go and be a warrior class. And that's not how so many young, African-American players growing up playing the game view it. They realize it a lot of times after the fact, and more realizing it now. But Tuberville is really, I think, just the most explicit example, really just a ghoulish figure in an era of Trump. It was, we can't forget, an era that was enabled by the neoliberal democratic policies that has existed under Obama, the policies of Clinton and the crime bill that created a sense of, I heard you, Jacquie, in your monologue talking about the disdain so many people have for the black male who may have voted for Trump, right, yesterday. And I think a lot of that, like, instead of like, well, why are people not mad at the Democratic Party and this establishment for just making people feel so desperate, so disaffected that they don't feel anything represents them? And we get figures like Tuberville. They're able to be created when we don't have, as a result of not having institutional, and it's a party that represents working class people, that represents the interests of oppressed nationalities and their voices, and the policies that are going to materially better their lives. And when the Democratic Party continues to siphon off the best of the leadership on the left, try to co-opt it and put it into organizing to just vote or die and all this other stuff, it's not an accident that we see some of these grotesque outcomes. And now we're dealing with the reality potentially of a Biden presidency and a Mitch McConnell Senate and more gridlock, and as Tuberville says, doesn't even support stimulus in a state that's, very already economically not in good shape. It speaks volumes, and especially the idea that this guy was even lauded at some point in the 1990s for, asking fans to, refrain from taking the Confederate flag to games. And the fact that how cynical it is, that's purely just about, we can't compete in recruiting. We're losing our share of the blacks is basically what he says. And just think of like the paternalistic like mentality that's like entailed in a viewpoint where you're wanting to remove a tradition at Ole Miss, not for any sort of, principled reasons, but purely because other schools are sitting there saying and telling players, rightfully so, that, you don't want to go there. Look, you're going to go to a game and they're going to have the Confederate battle flag waving all throughout the stand. So, yeah, you're right. He's talked about diseases flowing in from Africa. He's against even legal immigration. And it's remarkable, and it's not in a lot of ways, because it's, I think people need to wake up that there's a lot more of these figures out there than people probably believe. One, I'll give an example, Mike Leach at Mississippi State. If you recall this summer, Kylan Hill, the running back at Mississippi State, who had such a pivotal role in, I think, getting the flag changed in that state by saying he would sort of sit out the season, has opted out of the season. And there's a lot of talk that Leach and his Trumpist background, having coached at Washington State and Texas Tech, has really alienated a lot of Mississippi State's players, especially the black players. There's some comments he made, some issue with a noose. You can look back in Google if you want to, from this summer, where he thought was made a joke about a noose and on a social media post that prompted one defensive lineman to transfer. So these figures are out there. And now we're seeing it kind of unmasked in this age of Trumpism, where regardless of who wins this election, we're going to see this brand of politics and really live on. And I think that we cannot forget that the blame for that lies with the neoliberal establishment that has worked so hard to defeat the left before taking on these type of ghouls we see manifested in the likes of Tommy Tuberville.
Yeah, and of course, Nate, all of this is also happening as the coronavirus continues to impact sports on a number of levels. I mean, the Pac-12 football season was set to begin this weekend, but between University of Washington and California, but one player tested positive for coronavirus. And you mentioned Jason Whitlock earlier, who was, of course, one of the driving forces behind the right-wing sports media outlet Outkick. And they seem to have a serious issue with the fact that the game is being shut down over one asymptomatic positive COVID player. And this was clear in the way that they even wrote the piece about this, and on a couple of different occasions pointing out that basically it's just one player. They seem to forget that this is, in fact, a very infectious disease. And as such, all it takes is one person to infect a whole lot of people on either side. But I mean, I feel like there's a couple of things there, both in terms of how the pandemic is clearly still impacting college ball, and also how, right-wing elements in the sports media world are seeking to sort of downplay it as part of their, reactionary orientation towards the sport itself.
No doubt. And as I pointed out before, I really think that despite what Big Ten university presidents say and people that don't want to give President Trump or Outkick and Clay Travis or Jason Whitlock credit, I really believe that there's no doubt that the platform that Outkick has really has developed has really just, as I've pointed out many times, proliferated during this pandemic as a place for disaffected sports fans who are fleeing from the Colin Kaepernick type politics in sports, just pushed down their throats at the supposedly liberal socialist ESPN, which is funny when you think of $1 billion industry being characterized that way. But there we go, the times we live in. Nonetheless, it's just it's ridiculous. I mean, first of all, the Pac-12 season is just kicking off right now, and I think in large part too, that goes back to the advocacy you had being pushed by people like Travis, Whitlock, and Trump. And remember Trump in the presidential debate citing this. It's all about the idea they frame it, Whitlock does, through the lens of, look, I have football, and this is one of the biggest vehicles of social mobility, and that these out-of-touch white liberals, which he always frames the left as just being nothing more than wealthy liberals that watch MSNBC, which of course is, I guess, smart when you're a fraud like him, because what it does is that, leaves his, listeners who are already angry about things and don't like those kind of people. And those lots of Morning Joe type crowd, the David Ignatius, the warmongers that get on there and only talk about Trump because of personality things and how he's damaging the empire's sort of PR around the world. It does put you off, but that's not the left, as we know. And it's the distortion that it is, and the idea that these players are being denied an opportunity to better themselves and whatnot. It's just it's absolutely mind blowing. I mean, you can understand why players for both teams who've been practicing and been waiting and seeing all these other schools playing would want to play, but they're players. They're 18 to 22-year-olds, and they're it's why we're supposed to have adults here. And the idea that Whitlock is so wedded to that. I mean, it's not an accident that that's the reason he's sitting down interviewing President Trump with a one-on-one and really doing a lot of that quote-unquote promotion of the idea of how much Trump has done for the Black community. So it's messed up. It's messed up on a lot of levels. And
really appreciate you, as always, joining us, Nate, here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. But we will be back, so please stay with us.